Hello, and welcome to another Digital Photo Mentor photo editing live session. Tonight, I'm going to be using Lightroom as my main photo editor, but I may use a few others as well. We'll see how it goes. Welcome. I'm Darlene, and if you're new to the channel or to the editing live stream, then we welcome you. I'd love to have you join us on a regular basis. So please remember to subscribe to the channel and hit the notifications button so that you get notices when we have new videos available and when I'm live. So what I'm going to be doing today is editing your images, editing subscriber submitted images, showing you how I will approach the editing process on each of them, what I'm going to do to make the image pop or make the subject pop, and why. And we'll be using Lightroom as the primary tool to do that today. So let me hop over to Lightroom and we'll get started chit-chatting and working on some images. Okay, these are the images we're going to work with today. You may recognize them if you submitted them. We're going with a water theme today. So these are all like ponds, rivers, waterfalls, and stuff. So we're going with water theme today. Maybe because it's hot where I am, and some water would be very nice. So welcome everybody. Good morning, Linton from Australia. Always nice to have you. David, welcome from Ottawa. How are you? Stephanie, and not supposed to be this hot Oregon. Well, it's not supposed to be this hot Alberta either. So we're with you on that one. Marguerite, tell us it's not this hot in Alaska, Deb. Hopefully you've got some cool things. One thing I do want to mention before we even get started, Rob, if you want to grab that article on photographing the Northern Lights, if you live anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere, basically, and they may even show up in the Southern Hemisphere, there's been solar flares in the last few days, and apparently the activity on the sun is going to be ideal for creating northern lights or aurora. So if you are in the Southern Hemisphere, like Linton, then you would have the Southern Lights or the Aurora Borealis there. So we've got an article on how to photograph that. And I'm just going to, I'll pop that in the chat as well in case Rob hasn't found that already. So there's some tips for you on how to photograph the aurora if that's something that you want to do. Because I know we're going to go out tonight and possibly tonight and tomorrow night to try and capture some. So for those of you that don't live in the place where the aurora is going to show up, I'm going to be making an aurora sky pack. So you'll be able to take advantage of that even if you live near the equator. All right. Yes, depending on cloud cover. Aurora, Australia. Okay, cool. Good to know. Okay, so yes, we often set themes for the editing, such as winter. Not so much right now, David, but when I have images that are similar, I like to edit them together so that we can sort of copy and paste sometimes as well, because there's some similar ones from different people even that where the settings may apply nicely to another image. So yes, I like to go with something similar. Good day to you, Ron, as well. All right, so I'm going to start. Let's see, I've got some new images from some people that haven't submitted before, including Pierre, and he's a new student, so I want to make sure to do his as well. But I've got this one from Linton, and I like this. I want to work on this image here because, here, let me see if I can make there, that's better. I like the flowing lines here, and Linton's question when he submitted this image was, let me find it here. Where are we? Sorry, I can't quote you directly, Linton, but it was something about the leading lines of the water and bringing out the waterfall more. So I'm definitely going to do that. So when we look at an image, first of all, the first thing I want to do to analyze it is just look at the image without any distractions. So I will put it on full screen on my screen, and often sometimes I will even turn it upside down. So the keyboard shortcut that I'm using to do full screen is F on a window on a Mac machine, and Command or Control square bracket keys to do the rotating. if you could please share a link to our Lightroom keyboard shortcuts, please, Rob. If you do not already have our Lightroom keyboard shortcuts, if you're not part of the Lightroom course that we just completed last week, so it's nice to see some of you from the course, David, Sheila as well. You can use the Lightroom keyboard shortcuts to do things like this without having to find the menu or to use your mouse. So when we look at this image upside down, your eye will be drawn to the thing that most takes your attention. And in this case, this is all good because what's drawing my attention is the subject. And the four things that will grab your attention are the brightest areas, the areas of greatest sharpness, bright or intense color, especially warm colors, and high contrast. Okay, so in this case, we've got a really great image to start with because he's avoided all of those challenges in the background. So right off the bat, well done, Linton, for capturing a nice clean image. When we go to look at this in the develop module, we head over there. Oop, I just have to open my panels. There we go. When we look at this image in the develop module, just gonna close that here. I look at the histogram in terms of exposure, but I'm also going to change the color profile. So those are some of the first things that I do. I want to look for, is there anything going off the graph that I need to be concerned about? No. If we're not sure, just press J on your keyboard and that will show any clipping warnings, meaning there's detail or there's information off the graph on the top end or the bottom end. Highlights clipping will show up as red. So I'll just make some clipping for you. Let me just see here why it's not showing up. There we go. Right, so we can see that the red shows the highlights that are clipping. There we go. And the blue shows any shadows that are clipping. Okay. For some reason, my J, oh, there we go. Helps if I hit the right keyboard key. Okay. So white showing in red is the highlights clipping and black is the shadows clipping. So let me just reset that. So you can see we have none in the original, which is good. Right. I'm going to change the camera profile first. So that's this little 4 squares here. If you pull down the list, you'll only get Adobe ones and maybe the camera standard, but there's a lot more available here. Okay, so we're going to look for camera matching. Okay, and usually there's a landscape one in most cameras. Okay, so see there's landscape, and look what happens if I put my mouse over it. Look at how much more intense the color is of the greens, right? Landscape profiles usually bring out green and blue in an image. So when you have an image like this, start with a profile that's closer to what you want, and then you have less editing to do, okay? So now I really have very little to do to punch up the color and the greens. But we're going to keep working, right? The next thing I do is I adjust the endpoints. So I'm going to use my little shift double click trick. Okay, so if you don't know this one, hold your shift key down and hover over the word whites, double click on the word itself, and then the same thing for blacks. And what that does is it just kind of zaps the histogram over to the edge so that there is something touching the edge of the graph. Shouldn't be clipping. We see a little bit of the white in the waterfall there is clipping. So I'm just going to use my Alt Option key. Okay, so when you hold your Alt key down on a slider, it will show you clipping as well. So I'm just going to bring it down until there's no more whites clipping. And in terms of black, it's actually gone to the plus side, and I want to have a little bit of black clipping. So I'm going to go the opposite way, just so that there's a little bit of black clipping. The reason that you want to do this is it will give you maximum contrast and maximum control of your image, okay? We've lost a little bit of detail here in this waterfall, okay? But it's not clipping. It just sort of really, really bright, okay? But we can control that with the highlight slider. See that? See how it's really just affecting the waterfall? It's doing a nice job there. So I'm going to bring the highlights down like so. Okay, next I'm going to look at the white balance. Okay, we can go with one of these auto white balance. Let's see what auto chooses, and that's Lightroom trying to neutralize or adjust it to be neutral. Right, and actually it's actually not bad. I'm going to undo using Command or Control Z or Z depending on where you live. This one to me feels a little bit yellow, like these rocks should be a little bit more neutral, and overall it feels pretty yellowy green. So the auto actually did not too bad. The other one I like to try in scenarios like this is daylight, right? This one is usually pretty good in most scenarios. I just dialed the magenta down a little bit, usually to about 5. But in this case, it feels really green or blue, okay? So I'm going to actually go with the auto and then take out a little bit of the magenta because I think it's gone too far. So again, I'm using some tools that are built in here. We're using auto, and then I'm just sort of eyeballing it to taste, right? Like so. The next thing I generally do somewhere early on in the process is to crop the image. So let me ask you guys who are watching currently in the chat, how would you crop this image? Would you leave it as is? Would you take any bit of it out so that we can feature the waterfall? Always think in mind of what can we do to feature that waterfall and have the viewer's eye go directly to it. Australia turns green on St. Patrick's Day. Yeah, it's pretty brown, right? It's pretty gray. Only use the landscape profile. It's usually too green. So if it is too green, you can actually dial that down a little bit with the HSL panel as well. Okay. All right, let's see. Marguerite says crop a little bit from the bottom. David says tighten in on the waterfall. Freeform cropping. Okay, now we're just doing like crazy talk, Sheila. Highlighting the waterfall. Okay, so freeform and remove some foreground. Take off some of the bottom. Okay, so the consensus seems to be, Linton, take off some of the bottom, and that was my inclination as well. And I know that you like that water sort of flowing down because it does flow down into the waterfall, but I'm going to come back to that. So let's get the crop tool, okay? And I am going to take some off the bottom, but let's unlock it. So I'm gonna go freeform, Sheila, but I'm also going to take some off of this side here because there's this whole empty area to the right of this bush here or tree or whatever it is that really doesn't add to the scene. So I'm going to take most of it off. Okay, then I'm going to take some from the bottom, but I want to make sure we leave a little bit of that so we see where the water is falling from, and I might take some from here as well. So it's almost becoming almost more square. Okay, not quite square, but a bit more square. So something like that. Then now this little light tree over here kind of bugs me, but we'll deal with that in another way. So remember, break things, take your attention. I'm actually going to flip this image. Okay, before I do that, I want to make a virtual copy. Let me just get both of them here. Okay, so we've got, I'm going to do flip the original horizontal. Okay, now let's look at the two of them side by side. Okay, so when we look at the flipped version, sorry, this is the flipped one? Yes, okay, so this is the original one. I've forgotten which one we're doing here. Okay, so this is the original one. So our eye reads left to right. So I kind of don't start over here and follow the water. My eye starts over here and sort of starts up here at the rock and then ends up here, okay? When I flip it, now my eye follows this water down and around and over to the waterfall. And what that does is it makes the viewer sort of go around the image a little bit more and get more involved in it. And now I'm tempted to crop a little bit more off the bottom now that we've done that. Let me just make these a little bit smaller. Okay, so let's crop a little bit more off the bottom. But I still like this idea of having the eye come in here. Okay, and we're going to feature the waterfall another way as well. Okay, so now my eye is coming in, following the flow of the water. Okay. Let's see. Linton said he cropped a bit off the right and the bottom. Okay, which is what I've done, but I bet you didn't flip it. Okay. All right, so the next thing I want to do is now we've got the basic cropping, the color, the exposure is good, okay? Now I want to really bring the focus into the waterfall. We can add a vignette, but before I do a vignette, actually, let's do the vignette first, right? So we can do a vignette using the effects tool. So again, my trick is to drag the amount down and the feather down quite far, I'll feather to 0, and then adjust the size and the midpoint. Okay, so if I want it oval, but I want it in more like this. And if you want a vignette that is off-centered, right, you have to do a radial filter. You have to do a mask instead, because you cannot off-center a vignette in Lightroom. So what I think I'm going to do is keep this one a little bit light. So not as strong. I'm going to keep it a little more gentle. But you see the difference what that's doing is there's quite a bit of light trees on the edge here. And when I turn that on, it really forces our eye into the middle. Okay. Now I want to deal with this branch over here. And I want to see what's down here as well, because it looks like there's some foam or some water. But I want to deal with this branch. Okay. Now I could burn it using a mask, but my trick that I like to do is to actually use the spot removal tool. And this works really well inside of Lightroom, but set it to, you know, somewhere 50 to 60%. And I'm just going to draw a really big thing around it. It doesn't even have to be great. And then the source area, I'm just going to pick something that's really dark, like these trees over here, right? And then watch as I dial the opacity up. Okay, you'll see that that tree starts to disappear. Now, I'm not happy with how green it's going, so what I might do is pick a better source. Let's try something that's less green. There, that looks a little better. Okay, and then just dial the opacity up until it's sort of minimized. Right, so 0 opacity, I'm at about 80% or so, and you can still see the branch, but it's minimized. Okay, so that's my goal here, is to not completely necessarily eliminate it, but just minimize it so that it's not drawing attention. Okay. Now let's look at the image upside down again. So now that we've done our crop, let's see what's happening upside down now. Okay, so now is there anything else that we see here that's drawing our attention? Because we've done pretty well at getting the eyes going to the waterfall, right? And the lighting on the ferns and so on here. My eye goes to this little yellow leaf here, so I might tone that down. And this foam or whatever it is in the background here, it looks like it's the sort of end result of the waterfall, but my eye is going there. Okay, so when I look at it upside down, again, it helps you to figure out which parts of the image you're going to edit. Okay, so I'm just going to do the same thing with this leaf over here that I just did with that other branch. So I'm just going to draw around it and make sure I get an area that is like similar textured. So something that's fairly close to it. And in this case, I might take it out completely, right? Because it doesn't really add to the scene. If there was a little yellow leaf on the ledge here, okay, that might actually work well. To have a little leaf to grab your attention here. And that might be something that I would have done when I was shooting. I might have put a leaf there, or better yet, I probably would have made Rob put it there, right? Okay, so in this case, I'm going to clone it right out. Okay, then the water, that was the other issue. Let me get my mouse over here. There we go. Okay, so this water over here, I'm going to see if I can tone this down with this same tool. If not, we'll have to do a mask for it. So I'm just going to paint over it again. And it chooses a weird spot, of course. So I'm just going to choose a new spot. Something up here that's dark. And I don't necessarily want to clone it all the way out. But you see how it's just getting rid of things. Let's even go darker up here. Something like that. Okay, so see how it's cloning, it's getting rid of that white area and just toning it down a little bit. Now, if it's not, it's making sort of a weird pattern there. So if I'm not happy with that, I can do that with a mask as well, right? And the easiest way to do that with a mask is what? Which of these masks do you think will select this area the nicest? I could do a radial gradient and draw an oval around it and then just target the highlights, okay? Or I could do a luminance range, which is brightness. But let me show you what happens if I choose luminance range first, okay? So I'm just going to draw a little square over the white. And anything that you see that's red is currently being selected as part of the mask. Well, it's going to darken the waterfall and everything else, okay? We can refine it using this tool here and so on, but there's a simpler, better way to do that. If I just want that little area, is to do an intersection of the mask. Okay, so intersect mask means when I go here, intersect this mask with something else. It means it has to meet two criteria. So I've already said it needs to fall within that luminance or brightness range. The second thing I'm going to say is it must be within this radial circle that I'm about to draw. So then all I have to do is draw a little circle or oval around the area I want it to affect. Right? Now you could see that it's only affecting those bright areas of the brightness area that I selected inside that oval. Okay. Now I can use the tools here to darken it and darken the highlights. See how it's only affecting that area, like so. So now it just looks like another rock. Okay. And then I can even name this foam in water. You can name your masks so that you know what they are later if you need to edit them. Okay. So now let's see a before and after. Okay. We still haven't done a lot of what's called local editing. So we can also go in to do HSL and adjust some of the luminance. So this is where I would go if you felt that the greens were too green, Linton. You could either darken or lighten the greens. Okay, so you could see that I can actually bring the foliage out a bit more. And yellow, you'll notice there's quite a bit of yellow in the rock here. So if I want to minimize that rock, darkening the yellow is actually a good choice. So I'm going to go with that. So I'm going to darken the yellow and brighten the greens a little bit because these greens here sort of are outlining the waterfall really nicely. I like that. Orange is going to pick up the rock and some highlights and stuff over here. So actually brightening the oranges gives it a little bit more sort of depth in the picture. I like that. And blue and magenta, we may find some in the waterfall. See that? There's definitely blue in the water. So if we want to brighten it again, right, we can also try purple. See, there's purple in the water. Right? Now look how that's bringing out the foam here. So I play with all the colors. I play with all the colors just to see what it's doing. Now let's look at the difference. Okay, so before the HSL and after. Okay, so it's really minimizing the rock, bringing these bits of the water out. And I'm just going to dial them back a little bit, like so. Once I've done that, I'm going to go back and just check that I'm not clipping anything in the waterfall. No, we're good. But if you want to double check that there's lots of detail here, okay, we can just pull the highlights back down again, or now it's time to do a local adjustment or a mask on the waterfall itself. Okay, so I'm just going to draw. Let's see what it selects here. Let me just zoom out. Let me just see if I choose select subject, what Lightroom thinks is the subject. Okay, now look, it chose the waterfall. Pretty smart, okay? So I'm going to rename this one waterfall. And what I'm going to do with this one, let's get this out of the road, is I'm going to add texture and clarity. Okay, let me zoom in so you can see what's happening. Okay, so as we add texture, see how it's bringing out some of the water. We can bring the highlights down again, keep the detail. So it's a dance between when I add clarity, it gets darker. You see that? So then I don't need to bring the highlights down necessarily. Okay. Or we could go the other way and make the water smoother. Okay. Lower the texture if you want it more sort of blurry and fuzzy. So you get to decide, right? You've used the long exposure here. So let's keep the blurriness. Let's do something. I'm using the J key, okay, just to make sure that if I increase the whites, I don't get any clipping. Okay. Let's see what that's doing. Okay, blurring the waterfall a little bit. I kind of liked it with more texture. Let's give it some texture. There we go. We could also just brighten the whole area. So again, checking the J key, make sure we're not clipping anything, like so. This is pretty close to what I would do to finish. The only other thing I might do is darken the foreground a little bit more. And using the built-in vignette here, again, is going to darken this top part as well. So I'm going to use another mask. And this time, I'm going to use a linear grading because I want the bottom part of the image darkened, right? So right from the bottom up, and I'm just going to make the fade really big. So the further apart you drag the lines, the softer the fade. So it's going to be darkest at the bottom here, fading out to no effect by the time we get to the second line. Okay, so I'm just going to darken. And I might just bring it up a little bit higher. It feels like it's really magenta up in this area too. So I'm just going to give it a little bit of warmth. There we go. Okay, so see what that's doing is just darkening that foreground a little bit. Okay, so now our eye really goes to the waterfall. Let's look at the before and after. Excellent. All right, so what I would probably do to finish this one off, Linton, is I would hop over to Luminar and add my favorite, the mystical tool or the mystical filter, and give it just a little bit of that mystical glow. But that's pretty much finished. Great. Now, let's just see what happens if we do the same edit. Okay, I'm going to do the same edits over here. Let's just sync them up. Okay. Everything except the cropping. Actually, let's just do everything. Okay, so we've got everything here synced up. And let's see. See, the masks are off. Nope. It should sync for us. I screwed up. Let me undo that. Okay, there we go. I'm going to copy these settings, except for the crop. And paste them onto our one that's flipped the opposite way around. And let me just check the masking. Did it not do masking on here? Interesting. Why is it not showing us any masking? Right, now that they're basically the same, though, do we still prefer flipped one? Right? Which one do you guys prefer? This one or the original? I think they're actually both have merit. So your choice. Let's do another one. This one was submitted by Pierre. Now this one is a JPEG, so I'm going to have limited ability to edit this one. So Stephanie says nice for transformation. Was masking unchecked? Okay, I thought I synced them both. Let me try that again. I know that I did when I copied, right? So copy. You're right. Okay, masking was unchecked. There we go. Thank you. Okay. Sheila says not the original. So when we're looking at them here, right? That's the flipped version. That's the original. Okay. I think they both work. And the eye sort of comes in here, right? I think if you're going to go with the original without flipping it, because you know the location, Linton, it might not make sense flipped. I would come in more on the bottom then, if you're going to go with the original and have less of the foreground. Okay. Well, you did a good job editing last time, the one from the light show. So now your job is to match my edits again, Linton. Ron likes the original, but not flipped. Cropped, but not flipped. Okay. Stephanie did have keen eyes. Yes, thank you for picking that up, Stephanie. So this one here, which was submitted by Pierre, is a JPEG, as I said. So I'm going to have limited ability to edit this, and I'm not going to have access to things like the colored profile for the camera. Okay. But the main thing I want to point out here is that at first glance, I wasn't sure what the subject was? And can any of you tell me why that might be? Because if we look at this image upside down, right, remember those four things. Let me put that on the screen again. The four things that take your attention, right? The four things that grab your attention are those things. Okay. So do you see any of those things in the background? Yes, all of them, right? So we see bright areas, we see lots of color in the background, we see areas of contrast, and everything looks sharp. So it was really hard for me to distinguish the subject, and it actually took me a minute to realize that there was two ducks sitting on this log here. Okay. So I'm going to assume that the ducks were the subject. So the challenge here is that they take up a very small percentage of the image. And when we go to crop, right, I'm going to do a free form here because, first of all, I want to make sure it's straight. It seems crooked. It feels crooked to me anyways. I feel like it should be more like this. I'm going to come all the way down because you see what's happening in the background here. There's some people picnicking or something, as well as this tree stump here. And it's all really distracting. So I'm just going to get rid of all of it, right? As well as this foreground is fairly distracting as well. So keep these things in mind when you're photographing, because look at how much of the image we're actually cropping out, right? And that is about how I would crop this one. So if we look at the data here, and let me just get the metadata. Okay, the original is only 4,000. So it was shot vertically as well. So it was 4,032 by 3,024. And now the long side is 2,500. Okay, so I've cropped off almost 50% of the pixels, right? So keep in mind that when you are photographing things, try and get as close as possible, right? And you see there's no EXIF data here, which is information from the camera, because when Pierre sent me the JPEG, however he exported it, it didn't come with the metadata, okay? So I'm not able to analyze the exposure information. You can see up here that that's all blank as well, right? Yeah, see the ducks were not super obvious, right? So it took me a minute to find them as well. So now that we see the ducks, we have to deal with things like we've got some bright areas and high contrast. Okay, so I'm definitely going to bring the exposure down. And then we're going to bring the highlights down to try and control some of that. But the challenge when you have a JPEG like this is that if I bring the information down or the highlights down, it ends up sort of looking muddy just because it's a JPEG and there isn't a lot more data there. Okay. And because I've cropped off half the pixels, right, of the original image. So we're only going to be able to do so much with this, right? But I want to be able to bring the ducks out a little bit more. We could try to play with a camera profile, but honestly, I don't know if there's going to be one that is suitable. Maybe one of these vintage ones to give them sort of an old-fashioned look, because the whole image to me feels very monochrome. I'm not really keen on any of those. Let's just try one of these. I don't mind that one so much. The other thing is the water is very green, right? So I'm trying to sort of minimize making the water look green, and the actual color is going to be hard to adjust. So let's see what auto does. Okay, so it did take some green out. See how Lightroom added a bunch of magenta? Okay, so it did take some green out. And I want to sort of bring this contrast down. Let's do a vignette, and I'm just going to use one of my presets. So I'm using my medium vignette preset. And then I'm going to do select subject and see what Lightroom thinks. Okay, so it's selected the tree and the ducks and the reflection, which is great. So I'm actually going to use that and invert it to darken the water. Okay, so I selected and then I checked off invert. Okay, and then I'm just going to darken. Okay, so see the big difference? Now I'm going to take some of that green out of the water. There we go. See that? Now they're standing out a bit better. Okay, we can even just take some saturation out as well. And we could even do things like lower sharpness, lower the texture. Okay, be careful of too much minus clarity because it turns into sort of mush. And you can see that the reflection is not selected. So I want to be very careful here. I'm just going to go ever so slightly minus clarity and dial this back just a little bit. I might actually want to add, oops, I might want to add these blue bits here, right? So the mask is not selecting part of these blue things. So I'm going to add to the mask, and I'm just going to brush it in, and I'm going to use density fairly high. Okay, so see how when I brush that in, it now makes the reflection out of focus as well. And then I'm just going to do it again with a lower opacity of my brush and do the rest of the reflection. Okay, so I want the reflection minimized, but not as much as the rest of the water. Okay, can you see that? If I want more, just increase the density of your brush and paint again. Okay. So see what this one is doing? Look at the big difference. Okay. And then, of course, if I want to do anything to the ducks, I can do select subject again because we know that it did a good job. I'm going to bring the highlights down and the shadows up just to try and minimize some contrast because there's a lot of contrast here. And the other challenge with the JPEG is that it's already been sharpened. So I can't really do much in terms of actually fixing sharpness issues, but it almost feels like it's too sharp. So that's actually something that I'm going to talk about this week. I'm making a video on some editing sins and what it looks like when you over edit it. And one of those things is over sharpening, right? So let's see how we're doing. So there's the before and after. Now we see the ducks, right? This blue here is still really strong. So I might go down to HSL and use the targeted tool to try and either darken the blue. Not so much. I'm actually going to lighten it and then just take some of the blue saturation out. There we go. Because that's the really most intense color in the picture. So again, one of the 4 things that draws your attention is that intense color. So before, ducks are lost, especially on the uncropped image, and after. Do you want me to go more on the blue, Linton, or did I get it with that last HSL? Because I can take the blue down even more. How's that last one? It looks. Let's take it down a little bit more. There. We can even shift the hue of the blue, right? So if I shift it more towards green, it actually might blend better with the water. So how about that? Okay, something like that. So there we have the ducks. Let's see. Now I've got another image here that was a JPEG. And this one, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to edit because it's already been edited. This one you can see, though, does have the metadata. So when you do your export from Lightroom or however you're doing your editing, if you're using Lightroom, assuming you're watching this live, right? When you do your export and keep the metadata attached, then I have access to all this information, okay? And because it's a JPEG, again, it's limited. Let me see. Can I see what camera this used? No. So I don't know which camera model this was that made this camera. We can see the exposure information, okay, but nothing else. Now, the cool thing that I thought that was really cool about this image actually is I immediately thought of making an abstract out of it. And there's some neat stuff happening in the water and in the sky that's almost sort of mirroring each other, right? There's like some rocks or something underneath here. So again, I have limited information here that I can edit with because it's JPEG, but this was my thinking, right? So I want to straighten it first of all, because it seems like it's a tiny bit crooked. Let's do something like that. And then I want to get rid of sort of these trees over here on the right. Sorry, my left, my other right. Okay. Let's just check there we go. So I guess it was straight now that I cropped those out. And I want to play up the difference here or the similarities between the sky and the water. Okay, so this one actually is one that I would prefer to have the JPEG, and I'd want to make the colors match a little better. So if we want to do that, because the water is kind of purple, but the sky is sort of cyan. So if we want to do that, we need to do a selection of the sky. Okay. That's a good selection. And then we have a few choices. Okay, so I can just adjust the color sliders and see if I can add more purple or blue to make it match. Okay, that's closer, right? Or let me just reset that. So if you've done anything with your sliders and you want to undo everything, just double click the word effect. Okay, you can use this hue adjustment here. Okay, so I'm going to click off, choose fine adjustments. And when you start pulling this, here, let me undo this and show you what happens. You can literally change the color of things. So you're shifting the whole color. So if I go full on, we can really get close to matching that color. You see that? So that's a little bit too purple. So fine adjustment just means it goes slower on the scale. So let's do something like that. So I'm looking at this color, matching the colors in here a little better. Okay, so you see that? I'm going to actually blur the sky and take a bit of the texture out so it's not quite so sharp. Because again, I want to make it more abstract to match the water. Okay, so the water is sort of blurry. So I'm just going to do that. Minus sharpness, minus clarity, minus texture. And if we want to see what it's doing, see that? Right? Now there's a little bit of blue that's still off color over here. So I can try the HSL panel in the targeted tool and then just click on the blue that I want to alter the color of. So I'm going to click and slide up because it's going to send it towards more purple. Okay. And this is the advantage or the disadvantage, pardon me, of this tool in Lightroom is it applies globally. Okay. If I want to do just the edit on this part of the sky, I can't do it with and mask in HSL adjustments because you'll notice when you go to the masking tools, there is no HSL adjustment. Okay. So that isn't going to work. So I can undo that. It's going to do too much. We could try another way with a mask and do a color range. So if I just want this color, this sort of teal color, I'm going to minimize it. So I'm just getting the color over there. That's better. Okay. Now I can try to shift the hue of just that more this way. Okay. A little more blue. There we go. So now we're getting closer. Okay. Okay. Can you see where I'm going with that to try and match it? Okay. Now the thing is the trees are super sharp. So I'm going to do another mask. So this one is just the sky. And this one is left sky. And I'm going to do another one to select the trees. And what do you think I should use to select the trees? Okay. Make your guess in the chat. I'll give you 10 seconds to figure it out. See if you can guess what I'm going to use. So of these tools here, the masking tools, which one is going to be the best for choosing the trees? Guess now in the chat. If you're watching the replay of this video later, pause the video, make your guess, and then start it again and see if you got it right. Right? David says color range. We got 3 color ranges, right? Most likely that is going to be the best way because it's the only thing that's green in this picture, right? So if we go color range, and I can zoom in a little bit so I can choose the trees, right? So notice it did pick up some of the water as well, but we can do refinement and that actually helps, okay? But I want to make sure that I get all of the trees, okay? So I'm just going to go full on and say, okay, we want that. Then we can either intersect or subtract. So I'm going to subtract a linear gradient and just pull it up from the bottom. So I'm going to say, no, I don't want anything below here. Okay. And then I'm going to do another subtract so it doesn't get any. Oop, I forgot to tell it which kind. Another linear gradient and just say, no, I don't want anything up here either. Okay. So it's only getting the parts in the middle, which is the trees. Okay. Then once I've done that, I can actually expand it so it gets more of the trees. And what I'm going to do here is take the texture down and the sharpness down because the color of the trees, or the when I zoomed in, did you see how sharp they were? And that is another indication of this image being edited. Okay. I might even take the contrast down, and we could take the saturation down, or I can try and shift it and make them more blue. Right? Let's try and make the trees match. No, not so much. So let's try just giving it some blue. There we go. That's a little better, right? The trees are a little bluer now. Just trying to make it blend a little better so that they look like they're sort of part of that. Maybe I can increase the shadows. There we go. Okay, so minus texture, minus clarity, minus sharpness. Now you can see the trees start to minimize, right? So I've lowered the contrast by bringing the highlights down and the shadows up, as well as contrast down. Actually, brightening it helps too. Right? There we go. Something like that. Okay, so see where I'm going with that one. And now we've got this little red thing. Looks like a canoe over here. And you can see where I missed part of the trees that were blurring. Okay, so I didn't do a perfect job of masking because you want to zoom in to 100%. My mask there wasn't super great, so I'm going to refine that. And this last one was the trees, so we're going to name it trees. Okay, and I want to make sure that it's getting everything. Okay. So it's not picking up that little hut in the trees. But I can do a quick add. I can just add and just brush it in. Okay. There we go. So I'm just going to make sure that I haven't missed anything here in the trees. Using the brush to fill in any gaps. Okay. Just like so. So always check your masks, zoomed in and zoomed out. Right. Now the little red canoe, we could just minimize that using red. If we don't want the red canoe there, we can just dial the saturation of red down. And apparently it's not red. Let's see what color it is. See how I dialed the saturation of red down and it didn't do anything? Oh, it's magenta. Okay, tricked me. Okay, so if you're not sure, use the targeted tool, dial down the color, and then I can either darken it or lighten it. Let's just darken it. There we go. I could also just clone it out as well. So that's kind of the direction I would go with this image and make it more an abstract. If you want to go really funky with it, again, I would take this into Luminar and add some mystical and do some other blur type of effects here. If we go minus clarity, okay, that kind of makes some really cool stuff as well. It starts to blur everything. Right? Let's just add a little bit of black in, make sure we have some white. Right? And now it looks really kind of cool, right? We could even add some blue. Let's try that. Right. Or we could go really funky with the cropping and go another direction, because this was my first instinct as well, is to play around with that. Because it looks to me like, there's opera masks, right? The Phantom of the Opera. It looks like there's about 100 Phantom of the Operas under the water, right? So that's kind of what I would like to play with. That's what I saw. Okay. Soggy New Zealand. Well, we are hot Canada and hot Oregon here. Let's see. Rob's talking about the solar storm. Yes, we're going to be heading out tonight to do some aurora photography. Okay, so maybe share that link again for anybody that missed it. If you're watching this video recording later, check the description below for tips on how to photograph the aurora borealis, also called the northern lights or the southern lights if you are in the southern hemisphere. Okay. So this is kind of a cool image, and I would probably take this one to Luminar and crop it this way and just go with the abstraction, because you could do some really cool things here. Now that you just, you don't even know what it is, we can really just play with the color and get really funky, right? All right, so that's, let's see, we've done that one. Oops. We did that one. We did that one. Let's have a look at one of these. So this was submitted by a fellow named Keith. So he submitted two very similar images, looked like they were shot sort of one after the other. And if we look at the information, again, these are raw files. So the EXIF information is here, right? So taken with the Canon EOS Canada EOS 5D Mark III. You can see the exposure, f16, 1/50th of a second, ISO 100, okay? And another one, f16, okay? And this one was taken at 8:43, and this one was at 9:50. So yes, these are, looks like morning pictures taken within a few minutes of each other of the same scene. So what I want to do is edit the first one, and then we'll just copy and paste the settings onto the next one, or sync, okay? So as always, I'm going to do the camera profile, and let's try the landscape. Canon, I'm not a super fan of Canon's profiles, to be honest. I find them not so great. I find the portrait ones are too red. So let's take a look at some of the neutral ones. Okay, there's camera standard. Just look at the landscape. The sky is just too blue. Okay, so I'm going to go with either standard or neutral. I think standard on this one. Okay. Then we're going to look at the whites and the blacks. So I'm going to do shift, double click on both of them. You see that it brought the white slider up a little bit. And there's a tiny little bit of clipping in those clouds there, but that's okay. We're going to adjust the sky separately, so I'm not going to worry about it. And the land is really, really dark, okay? Now, the instinct a lot of times is to bring the exposure up, but when you do that, look what happens to the sky. Okay, so if we bring the exposure up, which is midtones, now the everything that's right of the midtones, which is highlights and brightness, are overexposed. Okay, so be careful of exposure. If we bring the shadow sliders up, or the shadow slider, now we get more light in the foreground, but does it match still, or is it off? So what I tend to do is I'll go a little bit with the shadow slider, okay, a little bit with the exposure, and then we're going to do more local adjustments using the masking tools to balance out the rest, okay? First, it's also crooked, so we need to do a crop, okay? Let's use the auto button in the crop tool. So it should look for the horizon and straighten it, okay? That looks better. The other way to do that with the crop tool is you can just sort of eyeball it when you click on it, or you can use this little ruler. So if you click on the ruler and you get this little sort of crosshairs thing, I don't know if you can see it. Here, let me see if I can make it zoom in. There, can you see that little crosshairs ruler thing? Okay. So when you click on the first part that you want to have straight, so I'm looking for the horizon. So I'm putting it on the edge of the water, and then I'm going to drag it over here. You can go all the way off the image, because the longer the line, the easier it is and more accurate to line up the horizon. Okay. So then when I click, it straightens that line. Okay. Then the next decision here is about how to crop it in terms of composition, okay? So when you have the horizon in the middle like this, there's equal amounts of sky to land. So unfortunately, the fellow that took it isn't here, so let's take your guys' opinion, okay? What is more important here? Is this image about the sky and the clouds? Do we want them to look at the sky and the clouds? Or is it the foreground, the land and the water? Right? Because we need to crop off some of one of those things, because really there's two different pictures here, right? Because the water and the land and the sky have equal proportions in the image, the viewer doesn't know what to look at. They don't know what's most important, right? So we need to make a decision. Now, if you're the photographer, then you know what your subject matter was. In this case, I don't have access to the photographer's thought process. So for me, I'm going to do what I think. Now, to me, the foreground is not that interesting. For me, the foreground is just here to support the clouds and the sky, right? So I'm going to come in and get rid of some of the foreground. I'm going to leave these nice piers because these are nice leading lines, but you see the difference here, right? And Trish says the foreground. Okay, Linton says foreground. Trish says foreground. Sheila says foreground, as we don't know what the foreground is. You can do more of the sky. Okay, so cropping out the foreground for Trish and Linton. Not sure if you're agreeing or disagreeing, but let's take a look at both versions. Okay, let's take a look at both versions. Okay, so I'm going to crop it this way. Okay, and then we're going to do a bit of editing, and then I'll make a duplicate or a virtual copy, and we'll crop it so that there's more foreground, and then we'll see which one is the best. Okay. But now look at the histogram, okay? It's much more balanced, okay? We've got lots of nice tones all the way across. There's a little bit of sky clipping, but again, we're going to do a separate edit on the sky, okay? I'm going to try white balance, daylight here, and it always tends to have magenta in it. But in this case, do we want to go with magenta? Do we want to make it more sort of, you know, sunset-y kind of this type of color, okay? I don't mind that color. I'm going to give it a bit of overall clarity, maybe about 20, okay? Then I'm going to go into the local edits. Before I do that, though, you can also go down into the calibration tool, and this is one that's not often very utilized. These sliders here will allow you to sort of tweak the camera profile, okay? So taking the blue saturation slider, it's red, green, and blue, sort of primary. Those are the main colors that make up your image, right? Take the blue saturation up. Watch what happens. Okay, so it intensified not only the blues, and this image is almost kind of monochromatic, right? There's lots of blue here, but see how it really sort of pulled the color out of the sky nicely as well. Okay, we can also shift the hue if we want a different kind of blue. Okay, let's see what happens if we do green. See how green affects the sky, even though there's no green in it? And likewise, we can affect the hue or the tint. Finally, red. Okay, so if we want more red, I'm not sure that that's really giving us any benefit. If we want more purple in the sky, we can do a little bit of that. Okay, so see what this is doing in terms of really adjusting the colors and tweaking a little bit. And we haven't done anything with HSL yet or the sky. Okay. So let's do a sky selection with a mask. There it is. I definitely want to make sure I get those highlights. So I've got the J key under my finger. Okay, so the highlights are clipping here. I want to make sure I get those. And then I'm going to lift the shadows a little bit and the exposure. So I want to brighten the sky just a tiny bit. I don't mind if there's just sort of that edge, that one cloud, because maybe the sun is right behind there. I don't mind if that one is clipping. Now I can decide, do I want to add more texture to the sky and make the clouds more punchy, right? Based on the fact that I've chosen to include more sky than foreground, I do want to punch up the sky a little bit. So I'm going to increase the texture and the clarity a bit. Okay. Now, the other part here, we're going to name this one, is we want to check the mask, because the mask did a good job, maybe not quite perfect along the edge here of the horizon, right? But if the sky is selected well and everything else we want to do is lighten all the opposite, we can just use this one, and there's a duplicate and invert here. Okay, so I can duplicate it and invert it. Now I have the opposite selection. Okay, so now we have the water and the land selected, and we can then brighten it. Look at the difference. See? If I just bring up the shadows on everything, it just starts to look like mud, right? So we can brighten it a little bit this way. I want to check the clipping warnings again. Also remember to use the white slider when you're brightening things. Okay, so it's going to bring your highlights up, and it will keep things from looking flat. So highlights up, whites up, and blacks down. Okay, keeping the contrast. We can give this one a little bit more blue and pink as well. Pick up some of those tones, like so. All right, so see the difference of when I edited the sky and the foreground separately. Okay, when we try and do a global edit on an image like this and bring up the shadows too far, you end up just with mud. Right, now we've got nice contrast all over the whole image. right? Now let's take a look at that cropping again. Okay, so if I duplicate, make a virtual copy, that was Command or Control apostrophe. Let's crop it so that we have more foreground this time. Okay, so now the horizon is getting towards the upper third. Okay, I kind of want to come to the edge of this thing here. Let's just go like that. We're going free form here. Okay, so now we've got more foreground. Let's compare. So now, left image or right image? Take a vote. There's one big challenge with the right image, and I'll tell you what that is, right? So I'll let you guys vote, left image or right image. We can also try flipping either or both of them. What does color calibration do that HSL doesn't? Color calibration tweaks or shifts every tone in the image, right? I covered this actually in my Lightroom class, Trish. Do you have my Lightroom class, or are you using Lightroom or are you using Luminar? Luminar does not have a similar tool to this. This is a Lightroom tool. So let me know which one you are using, Trish. I think if I could check my notes from what you've submitted previously, let me just have a look here. You are using Lightroom Classic as well, Trish. Okay, so what this tool does is it tweaks overall. I'll find a different image for you. Okay. Using Luminar more now. Okay, cool. So you can still use Lightroom as your base and then go to Luminar. Okay, so everybody is preferring the left image except for David. Okay, so David is going to be different, and that's totally cool. Oh, Linton likes the right one as well. Okay, so you guys have got a friend there. And then most of the other votes are for the left one. So the biggest challenge for me in the right image is that you've got these great leading lines, okay? But where are they leading to? So in Linton's image with the waterfall, we have the leading lines of the water, and they led us to the waterfall. The thing with the leading lines here is they take you off the pier, and there's nothing there. Okay, there's nothing for our eyes to land on in the water, right? If there was a sailboat right here, that would be great. Then I would do this cropping, okay? But because there isn't, right, I'm just going to use those leading lines to lead us to the sky, okay? So for me, the scene is more about serenity, peacefulness, and the open sky and the height of the sky gives more of that feeling, okay? I would agree, David. There's definitely more impact in the foreground, but it's lacking a subject for me on the one with more foreground. Now, just as a curiosity, let's just see what happens if we flip these. Okay, so if I flip this one this way, does that change anything? Here, let me get my head out of the road. Does that change anything? Because we read left to right, again, this has to do with, English society, right? Because we read left to right, you come in here, and this cropping is actually worse because then you hit the dock and you go zip right out of the picture, okay? Move the boat over. Not impossible, Ron, but tricky to do in Lightroom, yeah. And if I flip this one, oops, no, not rotate, okay, same thing, okay? Then your eye comes in here. Now, if there was a boat here on the boat launch or a big old bird, pelican or something sitting here, right, you need the leading lines to lead you to something. There has to be a subject somewhere, okay? So that's why I would go with this cropping. Yeah, if you wanted to move the boat over, it's also fairly small, Ron, so it really isn't going to make a feature subject. Right? To make a subject, I need something like this big, okay? So there's also visual mass, and the boat is like teeny, teeny, teeny. So visual mass is how much space does it take up of the image, which is why I cropped off some of the stuff on the bottom that was taking attention, right? So for me, this is a much stronger image, right? Is it the strongest image ever? No. Is it pleasing? Yes. Okay. And honestly, that's all that matters. Like in terms of, if this is your image, let let's just see who photographed this one. Okay, so if you're Keith, if this Keith is watching this and this is your image, you should be very pleased with this. You know, make a print, put it on your wall. Is it going to be pleasing to look at in your living room? Absolutely. And that's the bottom line. You know, if it's your image and you are pleased with it, keep doing that. You know, keep doing what you're doing, right? If you're not pleased and you want to know how to do better, then learn about composition and lighting and make sure that you have a key subject in your image, right? So in a scene like this, I would look for boats coming in, boats going out, somebody walking to the end of the pier, even somebody at the end here walking with a dog or standing there as a silhouette would make an interesting subject as well, right? Titanic size. Not quite Titanic size, Sheila, but you get the idea. Okay, so now that I've done this one, right, I'm going to turn the thumbnails back on. I'm going to copy, and I'm going to copy everything except the crop because we'll figure out the crop separately, right? And the other image that he shot a few minutes later, I'm going to paste, right? And see how it did a really good job, right? Even the masking, because we use the sky as the AI part, right? Look at how it found the sky. If I turn the masking on, and then here it found everything else, right? Versus if I had done tone or color or something, it might not have worked as well, right? Because the AI works really good on sky. Okay? So we still need to deal with the fact that it's crooked again, right? So we can do a crop. Let's just try auto. That is not straight. So it's what it looks for to straighten things is either the horizon, and you can see what it's done is it's taken this line in the sand as the horizon. Okay, so it's straightened to that. Obviously not correct. So I'm going to try the ruler again, and I'm going to go from here, and again use a long line because I'm trying to match the edge of the water. Oh, and it actually looks pretty straight, which is surprising. So it's an optical illusion, right? Because we think that it's crooked, but it's actually straight. Okay, so now we run into the same thing. We've got, roughly half of the image is sky, and then there's a whole lot of sand and stuff. And it's a similar thing, right? If I zoom in here, there's some birds sitting on the beach, but are they interesting enough? Are they interesting enough to grab our attention? Probably not. Okay, so I'm going to do something similar and go more panoramic with this one. Okay, something like that. Now, it does look crooked because of the images. The house on the side looks crooked, and that's maybe why it was also trying to straighten. But if this was shot with a wide lens, yeah, so it's pretty, it's a wide lens on a full frame, so a little wide. We're getting some distortion on the edges. Okay, so make sure we go down to lens corrections. Let's turn on chromatic aberration and the profile correction and see how that straightened a lot of the edge distortion as well. Okay. I'm actually going to leave some of the vignetting. Okay, so it's removing the edge corner vignette when your corners are too dark, but I actually don't mind that. Okay. Now, if we want to correct vertical lines, let's just see what happens if I choose auto here. Okay, so again, it's trying to straighten based on what it thinks, and it's just not doing a good job. So we could definitely try guided, but I'm not sure if there's anything in here that's really going to do a nice job. Yeah, maybe just rotate a little bit more. That's not too bad. Okay, so see how a copy and paste from the other one into this one, and then a couple of little tweaks, and we've got this image also edited. Okay. Yeah, and especially if you use a wide lens, Trish, you've got some beach images that have an optical illusion with the problem with the horizon because the horizon starts to look curved, right? Especially if you have a wide lens, and especially if you take a high vantage point, like if you were up on the hill or something. So yeah, it will definitely trick Lightroom into thinking that the edge of the water is potentially the horizon as well, right? So you definitely have to watch horizons when you're doing water like this. Small birds like a kingfisher are hard to photograph. Tripod is a must. You would know more about that than me, Brennan. You are definitely a better bird photographer. Right. So the same thing applies here. Okay. There's not a super really clear subject here. It's a nice scene. It's a pleasing scene. But again, I would want something in terms of a main subject, which is larger in the scene. Okay. So getting closer to your subject is another issue that I see happening a lot. So get clear on what it is you're photographing. One tip that I will leave you, I'm going to see if we can do one more image and then I have to sign out. But one tip that I will give you when you're doing things like this is that you want to ask yourself when you're taking the picture, why am I taking this? Okay, so ask yourself, why am I taking this picture in terms of what grabbed your attention to initially push the button? And then ask yourself, what do you want others to see about this scene? Then, when you review your image on the camera, before you leave the scene, take a look at it with critical eyes and say, have I achieved that? Can I show this picture to somebody else and will they understand what it is I want them to see? Okay. If the answer is no, or you're not sure, take a few more, experiment, do different compositions, move around the scene physically, move left, move right, stand up, crouch down on the ground, try different lenses and see what works best to convey the thing that you saw at that scene. Okay, I'm going to get off my soapbox there. Let's see if we can do one for Marty, if Marty is here. So this one here is a Sony file, I believe. And the challenge that I have with this one is that the water itself isn't sharp. And the thing that is sharp is this rock. Okay, so if we look at it at 100%, it's got some really cool sort of lichens and things on the rock or moss. And this tree is sharp, but this rock is not, and the waterfall and the water itself is not. Okay, now moving water is moving water, but you want to have either a little more depth of field when you're photographing this, or photograph a little further into the scene. Okay, so he's using f8 here at 1/25th of a second. Okay, now I'm curious if Marty is here. I don't think he is. Why you're using aperture priority and -2 exposure. So I'm going to guess that he wanted to maintain detail in the highlights. Okay, so he used -2 on the exposure value or exposure compensation to make sure that he's keeping the whites. Now that's probably a pretty good idea because there's definitely no whites clipping. Okay, you see that? But I would have liked a little bit more exposure about there. Okay, so it's probably about one stop underexposed. Okay, so -1 would have done the trick here. Okay, the other challenge is if you had used a tripod or if you had used a tripod and even smaller aperture, you get a slower shutter speed. You get more depth of field with the smaller aperture, and then the slower shutter speed or longer exposure, you get more of the blurry sort of water. Okay. Now, if you wanted to freeze the water and get the bubbles, you definitely wanted to focus further back. So I would have focused probably on this rock because the focus that wherever you hit your subject with focus on your camera, a single point, the focus is 1/3 closer to you, closer to the camera, and 2/3 behind where you focus. Okay, so keep in mind if you focus in the foreground here, you're not going to get as much in focus going back that way. Okay, so I would have focused a little further into the scene, but this tree here is kind of cool, right? Framing it. So let's see what we can do with it. All right, so let's try. Actually, let's take Linton's image, and I'm going to do a copy. I'm not going to do spot removal because that was the things that I removed. I'm not going to do crop. I am going to do, I'm not going to do the foam and the waterfall. Let's just see what happens if I do just the waterfall because that's the one that chose the subject, right? So I'm going to do that and paste it here and then just see what Lightroom chooses as the subject, okay? So it's a little dark, but we'll fix that, okay? What it chose as the subject was the rocks, okay? So whatever I did to the waterfall in the other image, it's done to the rocks, okay? So it's added texture clarity, which is fine. It added a little bit of exposure, and it brought the highlights down, which I'm not going to do. I'm actually going to boost the whites a little bit. But choosing that as the subject was okay. I might add to it and include, with a radial gradient, some of the water. Okay, so I'm just going to include more there. Okay, so now that's the area that is being selected, right? If I don't want this part over here selected, I can subtract it. And then I'm just going to use a brush real quick and just brush it out. Like that. Okay. And I could just call it water and rocks. Now I'm going to go back here. Now notice it chose camera landscape, right? Interestingly enough, because that's an ARW file and so is Linton's, they actually had the same cameras, right? So it chose the same profile when I copied and pasted, okay? So now I'm just going to check the whites using the Alt key and the blacks. I'm going to do a little less black and punch the exposure just a tiny bit. And this one I feel is a little bit magenta. So I'm going to dial back on the magenta. But let's just see a quick before and after of what I did from copying and pasting. So see how that actually did a really nice job. So completely different images by different photographers mostly worked with a little bit of tweak. Okay. Now, if the greens are too green, again, I talked about this Linton. So it's actually, we've used some green adjustments here in the other one to lighten the greens. And in this case, we might want to dial it back. Maybe we don't want so much green prominent. Okay, notice how there's a lot of yellow in the trees as well. But look at where else there's yellow. There's yellow in the rocks. There's yellow in the water. Okay, so I might want to keep yellow saturation and not so much green. Okay, I might want to increase any blue saturation just to see if there's any blue in the water. That's not bad. Like so. Okay, so there's a before and after. Now, would I crop this one? Okay, I might crop this one a little bit because I'm finding that there's just a tiny bit of these colors captured over here or caught over here. But I do like the tree coming right from the corner. Okay, so I'm just going to leave this side. And I'm going to come up from the bottom to get rid of some of this dead tree so that the rock is more prominent in the foreground than the dead tree. But other than that, I'm going to leave it like that. Okay. All right. So just a reminder, if you haven't already done our Lightroom course, Rob, are you back at your desk now? If you could please share a link for our Lightroom course, that would be awesome. And if you have done our Lightroom course and you haven't done a review for us yet, please leave a review for the course. We've got lots of great reviews. Thank you, David, so much for yours. I think, Brandon, have you left one as well? Thank you, everybody that did. Sheila as well did so. So let's see what she says. Could I add some texture or light on the bent over tree? I probably wouldn't, Sheila, because I want the eye to not go to it. If I go back to the tree, I want the eye not to go to it. So, oops, I didn't mean to highlight that. So I would probably not in this case, Sheila, because if I add some light to it, your eye is going to go to it, right? So for example, if I do a mask on this one and I choose luminance range, which is the dark tree, for example, okay, let's just minimize that a little bit here. Okay, so that's mostly the tree. Let's just do something like that. And so if I want to increase the brightness on the tree, there's not a lot there to begin with, right? So because it's super dark, but it's just going to bring the eye to the tree, and I don't want that, right? So I'm actually just gonna get rid of that. Yeah, and it's so dark that there's not really any detail there to bring out anyways. Right? If I bring up the shadows a little bit, you can see there's not much there. Okay. If anything, I would actually darken it and just make it black and make it be a shape. Okay. One more question. Thanks so much, Stephanie. I appreciate that. David is moving on to Photoshop. Awesome. Thanks very much. Do I feel that the tree is taking critical mass? Not in this case because it's dark. Remember the things that take your attention. It's not one of them, right? It's not contrasty. It's just it's got the darkness or the contrast between the subject and the black. So when you do something that's black as a frame, it won't take critical mass. No, because your eye literally looks past it, through it. Okay. Thanks so much, Sheila. And Rob has shared a link for anybody watching this video later for the Lightroom course. We have 47 lessons in that course. So I cover everything you need to know about using Lightroom and probably some stuff that you didn't know. So thanks everybody for joining. I would like to remind you also to continue to submit your images because I am coming up short on images to edit in Lightroom. These are pretty much the last ones that I have. I don't have a lot left. I've got a lot for Luminar for next week. But if you are using Lightroom and you want to see your images edited, submit them using that link, ideally raw files, and let me know what it is that you'd like to talk about with that image. If it's something that you're having trouble editing or you want to talk about composition specifically. So there's a place for that on the form when you submit your images. So thanks for joining in. I must have missed yours, Stephanie, because I collected them about an hour before the live. So I'll keep yours for next time. And thank you all for joining in as usual. It's always a very lively and engaged chat. Thank you for being here with us and for being our regular followers and fans. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.